It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen to you tonight. I guess I could just say he's a hometown boy who went to Truro Central School. He left Truro for a few years and I think I heard he did traveled a little bit. But the important thing is he's back now, and he frequents his public library in the company of his children, of his kids and beautiful grandchildren. So that's it. No. Stephen is an award-winning foreign correspondent who spent 20 years working for the New York Times. His postings placed him at the center of whatever has been going on. You name the area and what was going on, and he was there. From 83 to 89, he was the Times bureau chief in Nicaragua, and out of that assignment came 2 books. One was Bitter Fruit, and the other Blood of Brothers, Life and War in Nicaragua. The Columbia University awarded Kinzer its Maria Moore's Cabot Prize for outstanding coverage of Latin America. From 1990 to 96, he was posted in Germany, and that was there for the reunification. And from that post, he covered the emergence of post-communist Europe, including the wars in the former Yugoslavia. From 96 to 2000, he was named the chief of the newly opened bureau in Istanbul. And out of this assignment came another book, Crescent and Star, Turkey Between Two Worlds. And he also hosted Turkey's first radio show about the blues. And he's the author of the entry on Jelly Roll Morton in the New York Times Guide to Essential Knowledge. So he's a multifaceted man. He left the Times in 2005 to teach journalism, political science, and international relationships, and to write articles and books. His work has been in the New York Review of Books, The Guardian, the Boston Globe, taught at Northwestern University, Boston University, and continues to share his unique perspective on the world with many books, including the most recent ones being The Brothers, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, and Their Secret World War. The Wall Street Journal called it a fluently written, ingeniously researched, thrillerish work of popular history. And then in 1917, The True Flag, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and the Birth of the American Empire, which we have a few for sale tonight of that book, The True Flag. But tonight he will discuss his newest book, Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. And this book is so new that it isn't even available yet. However, we do have some copies for sale here, and it feels almost subversive to buy a book about the CIA before the release date. So I really like that. That's awesome. And he also does have free samples for us all. But the final introduction will be done by Stephen's granddaughter, Scarlett, who is going into the 3rd grade at Truro Central School. So come on up.
Welcome to the Truro Public Library, and Pops is going to be doing his speech, and he is the best pops in the world.
I can't top that. Thank you so much, Scarlett, and everybody for being here. It's wonderful to be here also on the 20th anniversary of the building. I actually had my very first library experiences here in Truro. I remember climbing up the stairs of the Cobb Library. The one book I can remember reading was a young adult biography of John Marshall. And sure enough, when I went to college, I wound up majoring in colonial American history. So it all started here in more ways than one. As many of you know, I also was the newspaper boy. When I was a kid going to Truro Central School, after school, I had the newspaper route. And now later on, I began to look back and wonder if somehow maybe something didn't rub off on me. All those days of carrying the bag with the newsprint, and then maybe that was what pushed me toward journalism. So the book I want to talk about tonight is really unique in my experience. As you heard, it hasn't come out yet. You can't order it on Amazon. This is the only place in the world where you can buy a copy, because those are the author's copies that they sent me that just arrived. So this is my 10th book, and I've written about a lot of stories that surprise people and even shock people. And some of the things that I've discovered in the course of my research are actually also quite shocking. But nothing compares to this. I am still in shock myself about what I discovered while writing this book. I'm about to go off on a book tour. I just heard I was going to be on Fresh Air soon, September 9th, for those of you that like that show. And I'll be traveling, promoting this book, and giving this speech. But this is the very first speech. This is really the kind of off-Broadway tryout. So I should get those little comment cards and see how I should adjust my presentation. So I think I discovered the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. Unless there's somebody else who worked in total anonymity and had a license to kill from the U.S. government, which this guy did. It really was a remarkable experience to live with this person over the years I was working on this book, and to grasp who he was and what he did. In addition, his story only reinforces the understanding that there's a secret history, there's a hidden history below the history that we see. And we rarely get a chance to peer into that wall, to smash behind the mask. And in this book, I think I managed to do that to a certain extent. Now, my favorite sentence in this book is the first sentence in the acknowledgments at the very end, where I say, everything in this book is true, but not everything that's true is in this book. I have no doubt that I have discovered way less than half, just a small percentage, of what Sidney Gottlieb was and did. He destroyed all the records of his activities when he left the CIA. So it's been painstaking to piece this together. But I do think I've now got at least some way for us to understand who this person was, who nobody has ever heard of, even within the CIA. We have living in Truro, as some of you may know, a former director of the CIA. He's a summer resident here. I told him, I'm writing a book about Sidney Gottlieb. He said, never heard of him. And I believe him. Directors of the CIA didn't even know this guy. So let me try to take you through his story. Who was Sidney Gottlieb, and what was the context in which he became the chief chemist of the CIA and therefore America's poisoner-in-chief? So the story starts during World War II. During this period, American intelligence officers began reporting that Japanese forces in China, in Manchuria, were using germ warfare, biological warfare. They were releasing infected insects and vermin. They were releasing toxins. And this began to concern people in Washington, as they thought this might be some form of warfare for which the United States should also be prepared. Around the same time, Winston Churchill received intelligence reports that the Nazis were preparing for a possible biological attack on England. Later on, it turned out that these reports were false. There were no such plans. Nonetheless, the Nazi doctors, as we all know, were very interested in carrying out experiments with exotic drugs on concentration camp inmates. So, President Roosevelt received an order, a request from Winston Churchill asking him to prepare a large quantity of anthrax bomblets to be used in retaliation in case the Nazis used them against England. And in a highly secret decision-making process, Roosevelt approved this, and he gave the job to a new agency, the Chemical Corps of the U.S. Army. Work was underway on building those bomblets in a factory in Indiana when the war ended. So they were never finally produced. But this was the beginning of biological warfare conceptions. in the United States. Now, right immediately after the war, Camp Detrick in Maryland, which was the center of the Chemical Corps, began to recede in importance. And the reason was people didn't think biowarfare was important anymore because we had nuclear weapons. So therefore, the idea of trying to control minds or infect people seemed less important. But then two things happened that electrified the CIA. One was a trial that some of you may have read about in Hungary of the Roman Catholic prelate, Cardinal Mindszenty. He was arrested, held for several months, and then he was put on a show trial in which, as the CIA officers assessed it, he seemed dazed, and he seemed to be kind of in a trance. He spoke in a monotone, and he confessed to outlandish crimes that he obviously had not committed, like currency manipulation and plotting to steal the royal jewels to reestablish the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the CIA watched this, and while the rest of the world was worried about the trial and the Pope excommunicated everybody that was involved in it, the CIA concentrated on the demeanor of Mindszenty. It made them think the communists have come up with a mind-control drug. Somehow they gave him something that made him say things that are not true, and he believes them. We don't have anything like this, so we better try to find it. Immediately after that, we had another even bigger shock. About 7,000 Americans who had been imprisoned during the Korean War were released. It turned out that many of them had written statements saying there were a lot of things about the United States they didn't like. More than 20 of them wouldn't even come home. And a number of the pilots in the U.S. military confessed to dropping germ warfare bombs over North Korea, something that the U.S. government fiercely denied. So the CIA developed this theory that as the returning prisoners were brought back across Russia, specifically Manchuria, they developed a kind of a blank space. And this must have been where they were given this mind control drug, because what other explanation could there be for some of our best young men to say, actually, a lot of things in America are bad and communism doesn't look so awful? It had to be some pernicious drug. And this terrified the CIA, that they thought, even though there was no concrete evidence of it, and it turned out not to be true, that the Soviets or the communists had developed a mind control drug. So Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, decided we have to do the same, whatever the cost. And of course, we were in this Cold War mentality that no cost was too high. We have to catch up and find a way to control people's minds, because it looks like the communists have been able to do it. So Dulles decided we needed to go outside the CIA and hire a chemist who could come in and direct this project. And that's when he found Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was such a different character from all the people who formed the early CIA. They were all aristocratic silver spoon types that had gone to the same prep schools and worked in the same investment banks. Gottlieb was 33 years old, from an immigrant Jewish family in the Bronx who had gone to Hebrew school and been bar mitzvahed, and he stuttered and he had a club foot. So he was just the opposite of the classic CIA type. Nonetheless, he was a determined research chemist, and because of his club foot, he had been turned down for service in World War II. This weighed on him very heavily. He had not been able to serve his country. And when the CIA located him as a well-reputed young chemist, 33 years old, working for the Food and Drug Administration, he jumped at the chance to compensate for the fact that he hadn't been able to serve in the Second World War. So Gottlieb took over the mind control project that Allen Dulles called MK Ultra. The name was intentionally chosen because for Dulles this was the ultra secret. Silly things like overthrowing the government of Guatemala or Iran would pale into complete insignificance if you could find a way to control people's minds. And that's why Dulles considered it the ultra project of the CIA. Of course, no one knew this was going on, and as I said, even in the CIA, you couldn't have counted on two hands how many people were even vaguely aware that this was happening. Gottlieb worked with almost no supervision. So, Gottlieb began with the idea that controlling people's minds is a two-part project. First, you have to find a way to blast away the mind that's in there. Then, you have to find a way to implant a new one. So, you have to work on step one first. How do you destroy the mind of a person? Well, you can use all kinds of drugs, you can use electroshock, you can use extremes of temperature and noise and all kinds of tortures. And Gottlieb relentlessly tried all of them. One of the first places he started working was at a safe house in Germany, which I've gone to visit. In fact, there's a photo of it in my book. It looks like a beautiful bed and breakfast. So the CIA bought this 1900 vintage chalet, and in the basement, they started torturing people or experimenting on people who they called expendables. So refugees that didn't have families, or people that were suspected of being enemy agents, or people that had no connection to anybody, they would grab and they would put into these underground cells, which the new owner of the house, who's renovated it into apartments, was very happy to show me. They're now the storerooms downstairs. This is where Gottlieb and his colleagues experimented with all kinds of drugs. And Gottlieb's chief partner in this was none other than Kurt Blume, the chief of the Nazi biowarfare project. So Nazi doctors came to work for MK Ultra, and it was logical because essentially these experiments, as the owner of this chalet told me, were nothing but a direct continuation of the experiments that had been carried out in the Nazi camps. And in fact, Gottlieb was later referred to as the psychedelic Mengele. And there's a lot of truth to that, not just in metaphoric terms, but actually the Nazi doctors and their counterparts from Japan came to work for MK Ultra, and the MK Ultra people were thrilled because these people had conducted experiments that Americans couldn't conduct. These were all experiments in which people died. So they could come and tell us, how many grams of sarin gas do you need to kill a person, and how long does it take? And in one of the reports, I even found out that this is a report that one of the Nazi doctors is given to the MK Ultra people. And he says, we also discovered that the age of the victim does not make any difference in the number of seconds it takes for the sarin to work. So you can just imagine the kind of experiments that they were carrying out. Kurt Blume was tried at Nuremberg as a war criminal. But the CIA got messages to the judges at the Nuremberg tribunal that we don't want to hang this guy, we want to hire him. And therefore, he was found innocent at the Nuremberg doctor's trial. He then became Gottlieb's partner, which makes the whole thing even more bizarre because had Gottlieb's parents, who were Jewish, not left Central Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, he quite possibly could have been forced into a ghetto and taken to a camp and been experimented to death by one of the very doctors he was now working with. So this operation began in Germany. It spread through various black sites. Then it came back to the United States. Gottlieb made contracts through MK Ultra with prisons in which the inmates would be given high doses of LSD because Gottlieb was especially fascinated with that drug. He tried all kinds of uppers and downers and the most extreme kinds of drug combinations, which I describe in my book, but he was obsessed with LSD. He really believed LSD was going to be the key to blowing off a person's mind. And so you can imagine the experiments that he commissioned. There was one in a prison hospital in Kentucky, in which the warden selected 7 African-American inmates, put them in small cells, and fed them quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days. The purpose was to see, is there a dose of LSD so great that it can blow your mind out? What if you do it in combination with massive electroshock and then deep temperature differences? He tried all sorts of combinations in hospitals and prisons around the United States and in Canada. So he really was America's most prolific torturer. Then, of course, he's the expert in chemistry. Not only is he an LSD maven, he is the first acid visionary. In 1953, Gottlieb persuaded the CIA to spend $240,000 to buy the world's entire supply of LSD. from the Sandoz chemical company in Switzerland that manufactured it. So he then distributed it to these hospitals all over America, these prisons, and told them to conduct these extreme experiments. People died, we don't know how many. Many lives were shattered forever. But Gottlieb also went on to do something else. Being the CIA's chief chemist, it was logical that he'd be the one the CIA would turn to when it needed poisons. In the mid-1950s, a CIA turncoat was discovered, a CIA officer who was feeding information to the Soviets. Allen Dulles invited him over to dinner. He essentially told him, "We know everything now." And the guy was walked home by two officers from the Office of Security at the CIA, and they gave him a capsule. Next morning, he was found dead in bed with the capsule beside his bed. The poison in that capsule was made by Sidney Gottlieb. He knew more about toxins and poisons than anyone in America, quite possibly anyone in the world. And he was an expert at making poisons that could kill without leaving any trace in an autopsy. He would also do things like when we needed to get rid of a colonel in the Middle East who we figured was a communist working in the Iraqi government. Gottlieb created a scarf that was laced with tuberculosis germs. It was passed to this guy and he died. It worked. So naturally, when it came time to carry out President Eisenhower's order to assassinate Fidel Castro, Gottlieb was the only person to turn to. He was the poisoner in chief. Gottlieb created all the poisons intended to kill Castro. Poison pills, poison darts, poison fountain pen, a wetsuit laced with toxins that would kill Castro when he put it on, which, needless to say, he never did. In 1960, President Eisenhower ordered the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the Prime Minister of the Congo. Gottlieb made a poison kit, and he personally carried it to the Congo and handed it to the CIA station chief and gave him his orders to use this to go out and kill Lumumba. As you may know, Lumumba was killed by a CIA Belgian squad in another way before the poison got to be used, but in this way, Gottlieb secured his reputation as the poisoner in chief. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of Gottlieb's legacy as I look back on it is that his experiments on LSD were not only this horrifically painful series of experiments on unwitting prisoners, like Whitey Bulger, who was one of them. He was given LSD for 16 months every day in the Atlanta penitentiary. And he later wrote that I thought I was going insane. And later on, actually, like 30 years later, it dawned on Whitey Bulger that this was not an effort to find a cure for schizophrenia, as he had been told, but it was part of a CIA experiment. And he told the other guys in his gang, "I'm going to find this Dr. Pfeiffer, and I'm going to kill him." He never managed to go and kill him, and Pfeiffer died a natural death. But that was one class of experiments that Gottlieb was carrying out. He also did another kind, in which he, through bogus foundations, announced to hospitals and clinics that he was interested in seeing how ordinary people would react to LSD. And they would be told this was LSD, and these would be volunteers. So all the money was out there. Overnight, a new market for LSD research grew up, and all these hospitals and clinics took advantage of this offer. So among the people that were the very earliest volunteers were Ken Kesey, who went on to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and that became the Bible of the counterculture. Allen Ginsberg got his first LSD from Sidney Gottlieb. He didn't know it, of course, nor did he even know that the CIA was involved, nor did the doctor who gave him the LSD know that the LSD and the whole project was backed by the CIA. Allen Ginsberg was sitting there, his first trip, he's listening to Tristan and Isolde with Sidney Gottlieb's LSD. Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, was another one of the guys who, at the Menlo Park Hospital in California, took LSD and loved it and started turning on all the other members of the Grateful Dead, and that became part of the whole LSD counterculture. So the drug that Gottlieb thought would allow the CIA to control humanity actually had the reverse effect of fueling a generational rebellion in the 60s that was dedicated to destroying everything that the CIA believed in and held dear. So that was maybe his most unexpected legacy. Later on, in the early 1960s, Gottlieb was forced to conclude, after 10 years of this amazing research, the most systematic search for mind control in the history of the world, that there is no such thing as mind control. It's not possible to condition a person the way he wanted to do. The idea that they had was, first of all, you get a truth serum. You make someone tell the truth. Then you get an amnesiac. You make people forget what they've done, so you can send them out to commit crimes. That's the Manchurian Candidate. Then they forget what they've done. And you can make them kill someone even though in their normal life they would never possibly kill someone. At the end, Gottlieb was forced to conclude all of this is nonsense. It's not true. And I have a whole section in my book speculating what led them to think this was possible. And I think at least part of the reason is the books and the stories, the short stories, the novels, the movies that were all focused on mind control. And I have a whole section explaining which ones they are. And I think the CIA guys were affected by this. They saw it on screen. You have these Svengali figures or gaslight. You can control someone's mind. They thought, oh, if it's on the movies, it must be real. Later on, the process was reversed. Fiction informed the MK Ultra concept. But later on, more recently, the story of MK Ultra has leaked into many popular books. I mean, the Bourne Identity and so many films about taking over people's minds, Men in Black, all those series are informed by MK Ultra. And there have been a number of popular culture references to MK Ultra quite directly. In the 1960s, after reaching this epochal conclusion, there is no such thing as mind control. It's something like, oh, well, never mind. All those people that died and all those people that suffered and all those people whose lives were shattered were victims in an effort to find something that, in the end, Gottlieb concluded does not exist. Nonetheless, Gottlieb didn't suffer at all from this conclusion, and he went on to a whole new phase in his career. He became the chief of the technical services staff, which is the group in the CIA that makes all the gadgets for the CIA. Remember Q in the James Bond books? That was Gottlieb. He made all the spy cameras that you put in your necktie and everything from a rubber inflatable boat to a machine that would collapse Soviet currency into a tiny package to cars that would be used to smuggle people out of hostile countries, to the sensors that were placed along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to guide the bombers from coming in. He also made up sensors that soldiers in Vietnam would put in the stocks of their M16s, and then they would leave the M16s on the battlefield in the hope that the enemy would pick them up and then they could then be tracked. So he had an entire new career as the head of technical services and the chief gadget maker for the CIA, a position that he held for longer than anybody else in the history of the CIA. Now, what kind of a person would do this? What was he like outside the CIA? This is another aspect that makes Sidney Gottlieb so remarkable. So Sidney Gottlieb was a spiritualist and a humanist. He lived in an eco-cabin with no running water. He grew his own vegetables. He got up every morning to milk his goats. He studied Buddhism. He was the most gentle-hearted torturer probably in all of history. And this Jekyll and Hyde aspect of his story makes the whole book even more interesting and more bizarre and more difficult to grasp. So, as I said, over the course of this book, I tried to come to grips with who was this guy, and in the end, how do you judge him? What can you say about him? I'm happy to report that just by coincidence, you're not only getting the first speech about this book, but in the audience is the guy that read the audiobook. And I have a couple of paragraphs at the end of my book in which I try to assess Gottlieb. And I want to conclude by asking Jim Lincoln to come up and read them, so you get not only have a preview of the book, but you'll have a preview of the audiobook.
History and morality loom like threatening clouds over any attempt to assess Sidney Gottlieb's life and work. He can be fairly praised as a patriot and just as fairly abhorred as demonic. Judging him requires a deep dive into the human mind and the human soul. Gottlieb saw himself as a spiritual person. By most definitions, though, true spirituality means that a measure of compassion and mindfulness informs every aspect of a person's life. That was not the case with Gottlieb. Neither his scientific curiosity, his sense of patriotism, or his acts of private charity justify his years of heinous assaults on the lives of others. Gottlieb searched relentlessly for inner peace, while just as relentlessly laying waste to other people's minds and bodies. He was a jumble of contradictory archetypes, a creator and destroyer, an outlaw who served power, a gentle-hearted torturer. Above all, he was an instrument of history. Understanding him is a deeply disturbing way of understanding ourselves.
Thank you. That was great. I'm looking forward to hearing the audiobook myself. So let me just conclude by giving you the footnotes. So then what happened? So Gottlieb died in, he retired from the CIA in 1973. Well, he couldn't go on to have a normal job. And what do you do after being the chief poisoner of the United States? And anyway, he didn't want to do that. And he and his wife were both very spiritual people. So he was Jewish, but he had lost faith in Judaism a long time ago. The wife was the daughter of a Protestant missionary in India. She had lost faith in Christianity a long time ago. So when Gottlieb retired, they sold all their belongings. They sold their little cabin in Virginia, the one that had no eco-toilet outside, and everything else they had. And they went to San Francisco and they got on a tramp steamer. And they started traveling and working in charitable organizations and wound their way back in India, where they started working in a hospital for lepers. And it was there in 1975 that Gottlieb finally got a call saying that the church committee in Washington has figured out who you are and they want to talk to you. So the anonymity that he had hoped would continue for the rest of his life was shattered. He was called back to Washington. He had to testify in front of Congress, although he did it under a pseudonym and in a hidden room. And then in 1977, after it turned out that a lot of what he said was very incomplete and inaccurate, he was called back again. But again, he also managed to fool the senators quite easily. They had no idea of what he was and who he had done, who he was and what he had done. But then some of the reports that came out about the CIA specified particular crimes that people were able to tie back to Gottlieb. And some of these became the basis of criminal prosecutions and criminal investigations. The FBI tried to investigate Gottlieb for destroying all the MK Ultra records because the destruction of federal property is a felony. But Gottlieb's lawyer, Terry Lenzner, had been very clever in getting him immunity from prosecution for his testimony in front of the Senate, so the FBI had to drop that case. In the early 50s, an American artist from New York met a guy with a club foot in a cafe in Paris, and that guy gave him a glass of Cointreau. The guy went into a mental collapse, and he never was able to work again. He lived in Greenwich Village sort of as a street person the rest of his life. That was most likely Gottlieb. And this guy, in 1975, more than 20 years later, read the things about, or his sister actually called him and said, "You got to read what's in the newspaper. That thing that happened to you, that Cointreau, it's coming together now." Sure enough, that case was taken up by a lawyer. They were forcing depositions out of Gottlieb. He had to spend hours and days under cross-examination from lawyers. He didn't confess anything, but the last years of his life were difficult. In addition, there was the case of Frank Olson, which is actually still active. Some of you may know the story that in 1953, a so-called army scientist went out the window of the Statler Hotel right across the street from Penn Station, now the Hotel Pennsylvania. room 1018A. I've been up there. So this guy was not an army scientist. He was one of Gottlieb's guys. And as you'll see from this book, he had become very disillusioned with what he was doing. He was shocked. He told one of his friends, I've watched them kill people. They're using Nazis. He went on and on. He said, I am quitting the CIA. That is it. And then he asked the guy, do you know a good journalist? A few days later, this guy went out the window of a 13th floor hotel room in New York City. That case, even now, next week, a week from this Friday, there's going to be a meeting at the New York Medical Examiner's office, breaking away from the Epstein case. She's going to look again into the Frank Olson case, which they now want to reclassify from cause unknown. It was originally suicide. Now it's cause unknown to homicide. That would open up an investigation. So just the fellow who was poisoned in Paris filed a lawsuit which got very advanced, and it was just about to come to trial in 1999 when Gottlieb died. A few days later, Frank Olson's son and the lawyer who was prosecuting this case got together in New York and drank a toast to the death of Gottlieb, who they considered a monster. But both of them reached the same conclusion. They both told me the same thing. Cause of death of Gottlieb was not announced. There was cremation, no funeral. They both said he killed himself. And they told me he was the instrument by which so much could come out that it would devastate him and the CIA. So it was better for him to fall on his sword. Now, we'll probably never know the answer to that. But in the last years of his life, as I quote a number of people saying, Gottlieb lived a life of, he became the spiritual person he always thought he was. He worked in a hospice. He got a degree in speech therapy so he could teach children that stuttered like he did. He acted on the planning board. He was in local plays in his community. He was Mr. Spirit. He was like an old hippie. He had Birkenstock sandals and he'd bicycle into town to get his newspaper. People loved him, but they could sense that there was something behind him. And many of the people I quote told me that he was obviously on a path of expiation. I talked to Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist who went out to visit Gottlieb, and he said he was a destroyed man. He was racked by guilt. If he had been Catholic, he would have gone to a monastery. So at the end of his life, although he refused forever to talk about MK Ultra, he obviously was troubled. And anyone who believes in Judgment Day or karmic payback would have to be troubled with a background like Sidney Gottlieb's. So this highly complex and contradictory figure is, I'm going to repeat something I said at the very beginning, probably the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. And my effort to try to change that and introduce him back into the historical record has begun with this speech. Thank you so much. We've got time for some questions. Yeah, sure, Chris.
Yes, I assume you're familiar with Robert Lipton's books?
Yes.
Chinese Thought Control and the Nazi Doctors.
Yes, the Nazi Doctor is one of the sources in my book.
I would assume so, yeah. And, you know, I was just thinking in relation, I gave you a book that my press published on Timothy Leary and the experiments they did with the Sandoz laboratories in Switzerland. It was amazing to me because they're all legal, all justified, and they had people to report on the LSD trips they took and try to make sense of it.
Which, of course, none of them knew was going back to the CIA.
Right.
Now, you mentioned Timothy Leary. Let me just make another comment. So everybody that you know of as an LSD evangelist, they got their LSD from Gottlieb at some point. And here's the Timothy Leary story. Timothy Leary's interest in psychedelics started when he read an article in 1957 that was published in Life magazine, a big spread about a couple of Americans who had found a village in Mexico where they could take magic mushrooms, and they did, and they reported on their experience. This riveted Tim Leary, and the first psychedelics he used were these magic mushrooms that he went to Mexico to use. Nobody knew it at the time, but that expedition of those two guys to go to Mexico to find the magic mushroom was sponsored by MK Ultra. That was a project of Gottlieb because he was interested in mushrooms and the plants and the animals and the microbes that would make poison. Gottlieb, for example, made the poison pin that Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, was given to slash himself with. Death in 15 seconds. Where did that come from? That little drop of poison had to be extracted minutely from several thousand Alaskan butter clams. That's the kind of work that he was doing in the laboratory that he maintained out at Camp Dietrich. So Leary was another guy who could trace the lineage of his interest in psychedelics. All goes back to Gottlieb. And many of them realized this later. Allen Ginsberg talked about it, Robert Hunter talked about it, and I even found an interview with John Lennon when he was asked about LSD, and he gave a great answer. We must always remember to thank the CIA. If he had known about Gottlieb, he would have said an even more exact thing, which was, we must always remember to thank Sidney Gottlieb. Yes?
Who would have the power in the American government to not let that doctor go through the...
Very good question. So why was he allowed to do this?
Yeah, well, how did he have the power to do this?
So, Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA at that time. His right-hand man was Richard Helms, who later became director of Central Intelligence. Helms was the patron of Sidney Gottlieb. He's the one that brought him in, monitored him. He had an official boss, but his real boss was Helms. And Helms essentially told him, we're in a war situation, everything is justified. So do whatever you have to do. And it's part of CIA culture that much remains unsaid. Ignorance is a cherished asset. You don't want to know too much. So Helms didn't want to know everything that Gottlieb was doing, only the rough outlines. Allen Dulles didn't want Helms to tell him even that much. Now, Allen Dulles used to have brunch with his brother, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, every Sunday when they were in town. John Foster Dulles, in turn, went every day when he was in town to the White House at 6 o'clock to have a drink with Eisenhower with nobody else present and no notes taken. So Eisenhower must have had at least a general idea that there was a project like this underway. Did he know that African American prisoners were being locked in cells and given quadruple doses of LSD for 77 days? Probably not. And he wouldn't have wanted to know that. So in the early CIA, as I have a quote from Ray Klein, who was one of those early officers, said, people like Helms would have thought it was actually quite foolish to be worried about the human cost of these operations. A few lives, or even a few hundred lives, of innocent people would seem like a very small price to pay in a climate when you thought you were looking for something that could be the key to world domination, and if the other people found it first, all human life on Earth was ended. I think, in a way, to a certain degree, we're working ourselves up into this fever again. They thought as John Foster Dulles said, only once in 1,000 years does civilization face a threat like we're facing now. Well, now it's 50 years later. We're hearing the same thing. Oh, we're under terrible threat from everywhere. People work themselves up into these threats. Maybe it makes them feel like they're at the edge of history. And then I think they lose sight of the question, which is an essential one in human society. Is there any limit to the amount of evil that can be done in a good cause before the evil starts to overwhelm the good? They lost sight of that entirely. And everything essentially was left up to Gottlieb. I think that something like MK Ultra would have existed even if Eisenhower and Dulles and Helms and Sidney Gottlieb had never been born. But without Sidney Gottlieb, it might well not have gotten nearly as extreme. He was not a sadist, but he might as well have been. And nobody was riding herd on him. No, in fact, it wasn't until 1960 that a new CIA director asked one of his aides for a report on MK Ultra. Nobody had ever heard of it. And when they got the report, it said, we have to stop doing this. We don't even know what it is, but it sounds terrible. So he really was allowed to function effectively without any supervision and to decide where in the world he wanted to go. He was going to Germany, he was going to Japan, Philippines, Korea, and they were grabbing people and using them in these horrific experiments. And he never had to report this to anybody. And the reports that he wrote for himself, he destroyed on the way out. So it's a very powerful story.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story that you tell, and it strikes me when people talk about quote-unquote conspiracy theories, that some conspiracy theories, in fact, are truths. And, you know, the idea that LSD was a CIA plot, it's true.
An unintended plot.
Right. But what also seems to me is that the issue is beyond Gottlieb. What kind of a system allows that and creates this to happen? This is not unique. You have the Tuskegee experiments, you have the sterilization of women in Puerto Rico, et cetera, et cetera. And so a question I would ask you is, what do you think might be going on today?
In 1970, President Nixon ordered the destruction of all toxic poisons in the hands of the U.S. government. The Army complied. Gottlieb did so very reluctantly, but his favorite poison, the saxitoxin, the one that comes from the Alaskan butter clams, he couldn't give himself the courage to get rid of it because he loved it so much. A single gram could kill 5,000 people. So he had 11 grams of it taken out of the Camp Dietrich, where they did their work, and put in a secret government laboratory. And it wasn't until years later, after Gottlieb was dead, that it was finally found and destroyed. So Camp Dietrich, this sprawling base in Maryland, was established by the Chemical Corps, the same guys that hired Frank Olson and then became the basis for MK Ultra. And it was the center of American chemical and biological research. So I went out there, naturally, as research for my book, and it's still functioning. It's still functioning at a very high level. It's a very busy base. It is the center for biological research of the U.S. Army. Scientists are working in sealed environments with highly toxic chemicals and germs. Part of this is to research exotic diseases. When America has to send vaccine for something exotic to some other country, that's where they get it. So, biological warfare is something that the United States has officially renounced. But let me put it this way. Japan is not allowed to have nuclear weapons, but in the business we say what Japan has is they have what we call a screwdriver bomb. They don't have a bomb, but they have enough pieces so that with one screwdriver they can put one together overnight. So we don't have a biowarfare program. But if suddenly there was a need for one, or somebody decided they wanted some bombs full of poison gas or germs, it would definitely be Camp Dietrich that would produce it. And for local interest, another little tidbit of this is that one of the laboratories, Lab 257, that was used mainly by the Army, but also by the CIA to test toxic chemicals, was on a place called Plum Island in Long Island Sound, and it's thought that that's where the deer swam over to Lyme, Connecticut. It started the Lyme disease. That poison may actually have come from this place. So knowing what I know now about Gottlieb in the 50s and how little anyone knew then, I wouldn't dare to guess what's going on now, but as I walked around the Camp Dietrich, I couldn't help myself but wonder. Yeah.
Did Gottlieb use LSD?
He did. He loved it. By his own account later, he used it 200 times. Now, when you read the memos that he wrote about what would we like to be able to do, they're so amazing. It's beyond science fiction. Forget the Twilight Zone. And I began to think, meanwhile, he's using LSD 200 times. There must be a connection between this vivid imagination of what we could find drugs to do and the fact that this guy is sitting on the home every weekend taking acid.
And the spirituality, maybe that's where it came from.
Well, he would sit. I found somebody that visited their house. He would sit by the pool and in the lotus position and meditate for a couple of hours. Maybe then I asked this girl, "What do you think he was on LSD?" She said, "Who knows?" But definitely the spirituality would have informed it, and how you reconcile these two sides of his personality was something that every obituary writer wrestled with. And I quote a number of the obituaries, so I won't go down the list, but you can't try to assess it without coming to grips with this very bizarre yin-yang aspect. Yeah.
Thank you. You must have had some very interesting evenings after doing days of research.
Well, my poor wife really suffered. She didn't like it.
I bet.
I didn't tell her even 10% of it, but it was too much.
Yeah. So I was very intrigued with the question that you asked about what made them think that this was possible. And you talked about the sci-fi stuff. And I'm thinking about like that period, you know, from the end of the 30s to
Exactly.
around 60 or so. And I was thinking about, you know, that period and the idea of mind control. So there's like the idea of Soviet mind control or kamikaze fighters. And there's just from something I've looked at is movie censors and even like the Frankfurt School philosophers believing that people could be controlled by the movies. And so, I mean, it's just intriguing that there's this period of where it seems worrisome, plausible. And and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that period and how people besides him thought that it was possible to control minds, and also why that would be a humanist thing to do.
Well, a lot of, I think what Dulles and his people were doing was what we would now call projection. So he figured that they must be doing what we're doing. They're probably doing something much worse. In fact, they weren't. There was no comparable program in the Soviet Union. They weren't just that advanced. They weren't thinking in that direction. And all those things like Cardinal Mindszenty, how was he made to say those things? Basically through very traditional means. They beat him up, they held him in a small cell, they repeatedly interrogated him, they put lights in his eyes. Same thing that's been going on for many years. But that's too easy an explanation. You want something more exotic. I quote a speech from Alan Dulles in which he talks about how dangerous the war for control of men's minds has become and what the Soviets are doing. And actually, I realized that the speech was a code that nobody could have picked up. What he was actually doing is saying what we are doing. But he's accusing the Soviets of doing it. And then he says, but we in the West are at a disadvantage. We have no human guinea pigs that we can use. Which was a complete lie, because that's exactly what he was doing. Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, wrote in his memoir, as I was floating down, I was thinking of all the torments and the tortures I knew was coming. And in the CIA, that's what they thought. They thought he's going to become one of the expendables. Just like what we did in that villa, they're going to do it to him. But they never did. And so we projected what we were doing onto what we assumed they were doing. And that's what justified us, our projection. As for the forces that led them to believe this, I do think it's a combination of the political moment and the stories that you imbibe. I began to realize in researching this book that it's very easy to confuse fiction and reality, and to, in our modern age especially, you see things on the movies, they even seem more real than reality. And so I saw Svengali. I saw how he did it. He hypnotized that guy. And then there were so many movies, Invasions of the Body Snatchers. There were books, Clockwork Orange, all these ways of controlling people's minds. And I think they had a great effect on a generation. It wasn't just that these guys read these books once they were working for the CIA. They were reading those books when they were 8 years old and watching those movies. And I speculate that must have given him the idea that this phenomenon that was made up by fiction writers was actually real. Yeah?
Well, thank you. Aren't we hearing that veterans who are multiple times going back to the battlefields are being given things that help them overcome the trauma so that they can go back?
It's really remarkable now. We're seeing a rebirth of LSD as an acceptable and actually positive therapeutic tool. There have been books recently about how it can be used to cure mental illness. Psilocybin has now been approved in several medical studies. That's the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. The mushrooms were just legalized in a referendum in Denver. And now other cities want to do the same thing. And I just read this week that James Lapine, the author of Sundays in the Park with George, is the author of a new musical that's going to be on Broadway this spring about LSD and how Cary Grant and Claire Booth Luce were immersed in it, both of which stories are in my book. So there's a rebirth of interest in LSD, and it was demonized for so long. Remember, Richard Nixon called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America. Actually, the most dangerous man in America was Sidney Gottlieb. Yeah, in the back?
Because you mentioned Timothy Leary again, I heard that Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was one of his students.
Yeah, so Kaczynski, I chose not to include him in this book because he didn't get his drugs, and the project that he worked on was not directly under the CIA. But yeah, he also was involved and was a subject in experiments or potent efforts at mind alteration that at Harvard that who knows, must have affected him in some way. In my books, I don't like speculation, so I only present what I'm sure of. But if that weren't true, Kaczynski would definitely be in my book. Yeah.
There's a new film that we just happened to see called Cold Case Hammerskull, which I would say everyone should watch. And in it, the U.S. The research indicates in trying to discover whether Hammerskull was assassinated, that was a hidden institute called the South African Institute for Maritime Research, and this guy, Keith Maxwell, who was not a doctor, had set up clinics in South Africa, and they were working on inoculating people, pretending to help people, but actually inoculating Black South Africans with the HIV virus in order to support the apartheid regime, and that the U.S. and Great Britain were part of it, as well as some other countries. What do you know about inoculating people with the HIV virus?
Well, I first of all, I love that movie, and I write a column for the Boston Globe every other Sunday. This Sunday, my column is about that movie. That's my next column. I've already sent it in. But I don't concentrate on that part. I concentrate on the story about who killed Hammerskull, which is something I've always been interested in. But that piece of the movie has now been criticized by physicians who say that you really can't inoculate people with the AIDS virus, and some people have called that piece of it into question. And I was actually a little unhappy that they put that in because it distracts from the movie about the focus on Hammerskull. But that is a whole other interesting story. Gottlieb was definitely the master of diseases. He, whenever asked to kill someone, he had a kind of an personal encyclopedia of which diseases kill people normally in those countries, so that he could then create a poison that would duplicate the symptoms of whatever people normally died of in that country. That's why I think he must have known more about poison than anybody in the world. I'm going to take one more question. Okay, go ahead.
So what do you think he really died of? What chemical or mechanism? And did he really commit suicide, or did the CIA offer him? He really had reasons.
Well, we just heard about conspiracy theories. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I also think there's the danger of being a non-conspiracy theorist, where you think that everything is what it seems to be. So how did Gottlieb really die? Did he die a natural death? Did he die of suicide? Or, as they say in Argentina, was he suicided? Your guess is as good as mine. I think nobody knew better than he did how to take a poison that nobody would ever be able to find. The wife did not announce the cause of death. It was a quick cremation, and she did not announce what she did with the ashes. One of the frustrating parts of this book was so Gottlieb had 4 children. They're now grown-ups, like our age. And naturally, that was one of my main targets, and I started emailing and Facebooking and everything. I didn't get any response. I got quite frustrated, and I was on my way to Wisconsin, where the eldest son lives. He's the state archivist of Wisconsin, and I was going to doorstop him, as we say, just go. I have to find him. Then I found another close relative, and she told me, don't bother, because before the mother survived another 10 years. Before she died, she got the 4 children together, And she made them promise never to speak about their father in public again. And she said to me, if it were up to me, I would talk to you, but that would be violating an agreement they made with their mother, so I'm not going to. They might know, or at least they would have an opinion. Actually, one of the most fascinating things about Gottlieb to me is he's still so mysterious. There's more about him in this book than has ever been written in history, but there's so many questions left open, which is another reason why we could probably stay here much longer, but I think some people are anxious to get home. I want to thank Scarlett for introducing me. Thank Tricia. I love this library. Thank you all for coming.